Good morning, colleagues. My name is Sarita Roberts-Bornas. I am an operations associate at the Inter-American Development Bank in the Bahamas country office. I'm happy to serve as host for this event. I am pleased to welcome you to this morning's webinar on good practices and lessons learned in post-disaster reconstruction, a knowledge event organized by the Inter-American Development Bank in collaboration with the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction, the Bahamas Disaster Reconstruction Authority, the National Emergency Management Agency, and the Ministry of Public Works. I'm also pleased to acknowledge the participation in and contribution of the following dignitaries to this morning's event. The Honorable Irma Lewis, Minister of State in the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction. Mr. Carl Smith, Permanent Secretary, the Ministry of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction. Ms. Catherine Forbes Smith, Managing Director, the Bahamas Disaster Reconstruction Authority, and our guest speakers. Mr. Daniel Best of the Caribbean Development Bank, Mr. Kenyuki Otsuyama of the University of Toronto, and Mr. Heidi Haru Tanaka of the Inter-American Development Bank.
So we could track it. Okay.
As we move into our agenda, I wish to advise that the webinar will be recorded for the purpose of preparing a meeting summary. Additionally, I would like to remind you of a few housekeeping matters, especially as we navigate this virtual space. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you are presenting. Please use the chat to post questions and comments. Our team will be monitoring the chat and responding to questions that are posted during the open dialogue question and answer period. Kindly start by stating to whom your comments is directed. We have a lot to get through in this 2-hour window allocated for this event, so we will now invite Mrs. Daniela Carrera-Markey, IDB Bahamas Country Office representative, to bring opening remarks. Okay, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Morning. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for participating on this important workshop on practices and lessons of post-disaster reconstruction. I want to thank the participation of all these speakers that are going to be sharing today with us their experience, their lessons learned, their knowledge on post-disaster reconstruction. I also want to thank Minister Lewis for participating with us and his team for working closely with us on this matter. I think today we're going to be able to hear from several experts from different geographies and different capacities on this important experience on post-disaster reconstruction. Well, as you all know, unfortunately, the Bahamas is extremely familiar with hurricanes and the reconstruction that is needed once these hurricanes affect any of the islands. And it will be, it is well known that these type of disasters are not only going to continue, but they have been gaining strength and less ability of being predicted over time. So if we look at the Bahamas and how these hurricanes are affected, we have an island nation that saw at least 8 significant hurricanes within the last decade, and that the effects of those hurricanes are still felt And especially if you consider Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Irma in 2017, and of course the Category 5 Hurricane Dorian last year. So all these hurricanes add up into the needs of what has to happen in how do the reconstruction, how to rebuild and gain resilience, and to be better equipped to withstand the next one. It has been estimated by some of the experts on the matter that the Bahamas has sustained around $7.7 billion in economic loss during this time. Tens of thousands of people have been affected, and unfortunately, there's been deaths that are still being accounted for because of the difficulties of these events. It's not an easy task. It's not an easy task to be prepared. It's not an easy task to rescue, and it's not an easy task to restructure, reconstruct the islands. And this year is even more difficult given the COVID-19 pandemic. So these are all things that must be considered when we think about how we can better support the people of the Bahamas to be more resilient and withstand these events. The IDB has been a development partner of the Bahamas for the last 40 years. And we have accompanied the country in many, many sectors. And reconstruction on disaster risk management policy, effects of hurricanes, what need to be done to be prepared, what needs to be done to reconstruct has been one of the key areas that we have devoted a lot of resources, knowledge, and follow up with the governments over time. We have a very strong team of people that have looked at these events in a very comprehensive, multi-sectoral, and multi-stakeholder approach. That is exactly what is needed in any country, and is even more needed in a country like the Bahamas that is basically some of many islands that can be affected, and that requires a lot of a strategic approach on how the resources can be deployed and used to do any of the reconstruction, but also the preparation and the recovery. Just to give you an example, in response to the devastating impact of Hurricane Dorian last year, what the IDB did was to set at least 4 different areas that we were supporting the government since 2019 on this. We approved 200,000 emergency humanitarian assistance TC. That was part of the packages that we support the governments when they're facing a natural disaster as Dorian. We disbursed 80 million of the contingency loan for natural disaster emergencies, which is used for the authorities to be able to react to the initial reconstruction of the areas that are affected by a natural disaster. Jointly with ECLA, we conducted the economic impact assessment of the damages and losses incurred by Hurricane Dorian that was recently published. And we shortened significantly the timeline of approval of an energy operation that was already in the works, and that we very swiftly readjusted together with the authorities into including the areas of reconstruction and resilience in the energy sector, in particular for the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama. Now today, I'm also pleased to announce that the bank has recently approved a $600,000 grant through a project, through a special fund from Japan entitled Capacity Strengthening for a More Resilient Bahamas. The objective of this technical cooperation is to support the Bahamas government specifically for efficient and effective post-Hurricane Dorian reconstruction, as well as to improve the nation's resilience against future natural disasters and pandemics. Our commitment to work side by side with the Bahama people to strengthen national initiatives for sustainability and enhance the quality of the lives of the Bahamians. So today is the first activity of this technical cooperation, and is basically intended to share these important international good practices and lessons learned of post-disaster reconstruction. I hope it's a great workshop that everybody is able to participate and get a better sense of the strategic decisions that we all need to make in terms of disaster risk management. Thanks again for your participation.
Thank you, Mrs. Daniela Carrera-Markey, IDB representative. The Honorable Iram Lewis is the Member of Parliament for Central Grand Bahama and is Minister of State in the Ministry Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction, which is a new ministry created in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. The ministry, which functions as an authority, provides coordination and focus to the national response for recovery and reconstruction of Grand Bahama and Abaco, and has been instrumental in supporting NEMA, relations with family island committees and administrators, disaster preparedness, disaster response, disaster relief, and recovery. I am pleased now to invite the Honorable Iram Lewis to bring opening remarks. Over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Madam Moderator. Daniela Carrera, IDB Bahamas Country Office Representative. Thank you for your wonderful remarks. Distinguished panelists, participants, good day to all. In March 2015, the Bahamas signed the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2013, which outlined 7 targets and 4 priorities for action to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risk. One of the 4 priorities is entitled Enhancing Disaster Preparedness for Effective Response and to Build Back Better in Recovery, Rehabilitation, and Reconstruction. In the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian, the government of the Bahamas created a new Ministry of Disaster Preparedness Management and Reconstruction and the Disaster Reconstruction Authority to work collaboratively with the National Emergency Management Agency, or NEMA, for a more effective and efficient implementation of comprehensive disaster management. Also in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian, there was an unprecedented outpouring of offers of assistance from national, regional, and international entities, which we thank you. The International American Development Bank, IDB, was among the regional entities, and its assistance included the conduct of a damage and loss assessment, or DALA. The DALA report pegs economic damages and losses at some $3.4 billion and recommends several actions to be enforced for more efficient, medium, and long-term reconstruction processes, as well as to build a more resilient country against the increasing climate hazards. The government of the Bahamas also embraced the assistance of the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, that has engaged the University of the West Indies, UWI, Advisory Reconstruction Team to work with the Bahamas in articulating a resilient recovery policy, strategy, and implementation plan with appropriate institutional arrangements. We must be cognizant of the gap in funding, management, and delivery between short-term effective humanitarian relief and long-term reconstruction. I am therefore very thankful to the IDB for organizing this workshop and to the presenters and participants to sharing practices and lessons learned in post-disaster reconstruction. Moreover, I am hopeful that this exercise will assist us in devising an effective framework for bridging the gap between short-term relief and long-term recovery by drawing on analysis of system failures and successes seen in past disaster. I will be available for questions if necessary, but I'm very interested in hearing the details of this forum, and I will sit back, relax, and learn as much as I can along with the rest of the country. Once again, thank you very much for this invitation, and I bid you all a very good day and a very effective forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. In support Can everyone hear me?
I can.
Great. In support of the National Strategy of Rebuilding a Resilient Bahamas, the Bahamas Disaster Reconstruction Authority spearheads the government's response effort in conjunction with NGOs, charities, churches, businesses, multilateral organizations, and individuals. The DRA and its partners in the private sector and civil society are working to assist residents in the disaster zones of Abaco and Grand Bahama to build back better and restore their lives. I am pleased to invite Mrs. Catherine Ford Smith, Managing Director of the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, to present our keynote address, Reconstruction Strategies for the Bahamas Post-Dorian, Addressing the Risk and Challenges. Over to you, Mrs. Ford. Thank you.
Beautiful, quiet, peaceful serenity are the islands of the Bahamas. Then, on September 1st, 2019, what would be known as the worst Atlantic hurricane in history made landfall, devastating the northern Bahamas as a Category 5 storm.
It's truly just, there's no words. It's very hard to describe what's going on.
People who've been trapped in their houses now for 3 days.
Is straight from the gates of hell. There is no other way to explain it.
Wind gusts of up to 220 miles per hour swept away our people and destroyed property in its wake. Sustained winds exceeded an unheard of 185 miles per hour. Dorian wiped entire communities off of the map. Citizens struggled to help rescue neighbors while rescuing themselves. The death toll and property damage are still unconfirmed. It's staggering and shakes the very foundations of our country. Immediately after the passing of the storm, the damage was unprecedented, and no one word could truly describe the devastation. Individuals could no longer recognize what they once called home. The sight was heart-wrenching. Yet, amongst this tragedy, an opportunity arose. Opportunity to rebuild, but better and more resilient than before. Thus, the DRA was formed. With multiple priorities, the first being an extensive cleanup, we started to see hope manifest itself in people, nonprofit organizations, and the future. Our people had to fight to make it through each day on the impacted islands. To this day, those affected deal with chronic mental anxiety from the events that took place. We now face the historic challenge of rebuilding after this crisis. The road to recovery will be long and hard. However, the DRA is committed to seeing it through. In the last year, we have helped thousands with home reconstruction, rebuilding schools, environmental cleanup, and even helping families find closure. But the job is not done. It's just getting started. We will rebuild, better and together. We will be better because of this than we ever were before.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me quite well. I am really pleased that the DRA has been asked to participate in this workshop because I think all of us are very excited about the panelists and to really learn from this workshop. I'm joined this morning also with the chairman and deputy chairman, John Michael Clark and Algernon Cargill, and a number of other directors representing other government agencies who have all been working jointly in this journey to rebuilding our northern islands much better. My name, as they've indicated, is Catherine Smith. I'm currently serving as the first managing director for the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, and I hope I'm not the last because the work on the rebuild is definitely a handful, and it will take quite some time to get through this process. Our work as an authority began on December 1st, when our board first met, and I joined the board on December 3rd. We soon discovered the work was a monumental task and realized that we had to set priorities around our work. And then we set those that needed to be addressed first, which fell under these priorities that you're looking at now on the screen. Our biggest challenge has been obviously the environment with the debris cleanup, temporary housing, medium housing, and also the long-term strategy for permanent housing. And of course, education as a result of the pending school opening, and of course, developing community shelters around and hurricane shelters around and in each community. Those will be the primary focus of my presentation and what we've been able to achieve in this first year. The other slide speaks to the environment, and we've had a big challenge in terms of just how much debris had to be dealt with as a result of Dorian, both in the eastern end of Grand Bahama and generally around the city of Freeport as well, and particularly in Abaco and the Keys. We have 3 debris management sites currently operational in Abaco, Treasure Key, Spring City, and Snake Key. And then of course, High Rock, Pelican Point, and McLean's Town in the eastern end of the island. One of the things, you can go on, Randy, one of the things that has really been good for us is the fact that more than $30 million has been spent and stayed in the community with the overall cleanup. We've also engaged more than 20 plus local Bahamian contractors who have been involved in the community cleanup. And I must say that a lot of people obviously in our country have not been involved in anything like this before in terms of a Category 5 storm. But the point is that Bahamians came on board having some skill sets in other areas of construction, but was able to really come to the forefront and do the work. And I think that is really a good thing, and it was important for us to keep the money in the community. Also, in terms of the environment, marine cleanup is a focus for us, even though we haven't really gotten to the point in terms of really surveying the surrounding areas in the Keys as well as in East Grand Bahama. We've had a lot of NGOs who've done some work in surveying the marine cleanup, but it is difficult. And while we focus on a lot of these priorities, one of the difficult priorities has been getting to the marine cleanup. Housing, I consider our flagship program within the DRA. Obviously, so many homes had been damaged in Hurricane Dorian. We had to find a way as a government to also get people registered for our program and to really get people's roofs fixed and dried in so that they could begin their interior work. And if you look at the statistics, just over 4,000 people have registered, over 3,000 approved, and the government to date has allocated 10 million. Based on where we are right now, we know that that 10 million will not be enough. So as you can well imagine, funding and finances is a real problem. The other thing that we have had to focus on in the housing arena is the fact that Abaco in particular, people lost so many of not just their homes, but they also lost the temporary rentals that people had in Abaco. And so we have had to find temporary structures for homeowners for them to be able to rebuild their homes. Right now, we're kind of pleased about the donations that we're getting in terms of Sweetings Key. We're right in the middle of erecting container homes for residents of Sweetings Key, and another 40 temporary domes for the residents of East Grand Bahama. And of course, in Abaco, there will be more than 150 domes spread all over Abaco. The medium term solution for us is modular homes as well. And this is a picture of what that area in Spring City looks like that we intend to erect modular homes in. And these modular homes are necessary for basically public service workers who need to be able to work in Abaco. And quite frankly, the 100 is probably not enough when you consider teachers and police officers, defense force officers, persons just working in various government service, offering government services. We already know that this number needs to be closer to 200. The other thing that we're doing is permanent housing solutions. What does that look like? The government of the Bahamas has transferred and conveyed 2 60-acre mixed-use residential lots to the DRA for development of permanent housing in Abaco. And we're right in the middle of really looking at the RFP for that. We've already done pre-qualification notices, so we know where the interest lies. But obviously, this is a more permanent long-term solution, but it's one that we hope to start in terms of construction early January 2021. The other problem we've had is over the years, church buildings as well as schools have traditionally been used as hurricane shelters. And they're not really constructed for the strength, certainly, of a Dorian. What we are now doing is looking at the development of community centers, hurricane shelters in Abaco and in Grand Bahama. And the picture that I have there, the yellow portion, is where the first community center hurricane shelter will be erected in the Central Pines area of Abaco. And we're working feverishly to come up with a methodology of construction. And again, the RFPs have already gone out for those interested persons. We expect to get them back on September 9th and hopefully be able to begin the construction of this particular community center hurricane shelter by October 1st. Education, also a big challenge for us because 14 schools were impacted in Abaco. And as you can see, this is one of the new schools in Green Turtle Key that's under construction. Patrick J. Bethel School is undergoing major renovations, one of the 14 schools, and of course the Amy Roberts Primary School. But what is good to report is that we've had great support from NGOs throughout Abaco and in Grand Bahama who are on island, who have been very, very instrumental in assisting us with getting schools repaired. NGOs like Global Empowerment and so many other NGOs. Go ahead. In Grand Bahama, we had 17 schools that were impacted. 4 of the schools in East Grand Bahama were completely destroyed. It is anticipated that a comprehensive school in East Grand Bahama will replace those 4 schools. Health, luckily for us, the government complex and the Marsh Harbor Health Center survived the hurricane in many, many ways. There was obviously some damages to both buildings, but very, very minimal. So the medical facilities in Abaco are 100% open and operational. Our biggest challenge is the Rand Memorial Hospital in Freeport, where it is currently undergoing a renovation program of $10 million. We also are looking at a risk assessment to look at whether or not a new hospital will be built at its current location or at a new site in Freeport. But this hospital is paramount for the future development of Freeport. I like to show this slide because, again, I want to reiterate how much of the $30 million that went to debris cleanup and really spent through the Department of Environmental Health, the Ministry of Works, and now the DRA that has stayed in country. And I always tell this story about people who have come to the Bahamas after the hurricane and came and told us that, you know, this whole debris process was going to be a $100 million job. I suspect by the time we finish the salvage yards, the marine cleanup, it'll probably be closer to 50. But I think we've been able to manage our funding much better internally as a country. Also, the Small Business Development Center has fast-tracked a number of programs to allow for small businesses to get started and to resume, and $3.4 million to date has been spent both in Abaco and in Grand Bahama. Part of our problem in the DRA is going to be how we monetize some of these projects to be able to put money back into these disaster zones and to really continue the DRA work. So we're looking at these partnerships for the salvage yard, for temporary housing, for the subdivision development, and obviously once the debris has been segregated, what can we do? How do we sell it? What do we do with it? And that's something very interesting that I have on a slide that I would like our panel to help us address as well. Infrastructure, you can see many people who are in the Bahamas know about the Fishing Hole Road and what it looked like. And obviously the stabilization and roadworks project currently going on in Hopetown and Elbow Key. But you know, sadly to say, infrastructure, we've been able to look at a lot of things. There have been things that have been done, but when you look at the priorities that we needed to concentrate on for the last several months, I think infrastructure is a priority, but not one of those priorities that we have given the attention we need to certainly for the future. Now, fundraising is a big deal for us. You know, everybody knows about the infamous, and I call it the infamous pledge conference, where people felt that we collected $1.77 billion in cash, which never happened. But our development office is actively trying to secure the fundraising. It's been a very challenging and difficult time, particularly COVID-19 has not helped us, but we are still working on fundraising. We see that the fundraising efforts of the DRA is going to be so important as we continue to do our work. This is just another slide showing where we are in terms of fundraising and the work that we continue to do. It's always a challenge to get people to understand that a lot of this fundraising work is on technical assistance, equity financing, and gifts in kind. And I always tell people, no matter what how much money a donor wants to donate, they have some priorities and special interests where they would like to see their money spent. And for us, it's always a challenge also to align those projects and interests with what the DRA and the government's priorities are. System improvement is something that, as we have been doing our work in the DRA and going from community to community, some of the things that we really have to look at as a country is how we handle municipal waste barging from these isolated keys, just the whole issue of solar energy. Abaco definitely needs a landfill. And of course, we're spending so much money on putting up and restoring all of the transmission lines overhead. And the question begins, you ask the question whether or not it makes sense, or how do we get it underground? And because every hurricane that comes in just knocks it down again. So, I just put this slide up there for people to understand that there are some systemic issues that we continue to see as a country that we need to address in a more defined way. And finally, this is the slide that interests me the most, because I hope that our panel can address these issues and speak to it. I know the minister spoke to this whole policy development framework that's currently being worked on in conjunction and in collaboration with the University of the West Indies and UNDP. The question about COVID, has COVID caused any issues for us in reconstruction? Absolutely. Our people, even though construction was continued in the disaster zones, you still have a sense that your staff need to be very careful. One of my biggest issues with fundraising, as I said, is how do we match donor funding, and how do we get donors to be more aligned with the DRA priorities? And of course, the minister also talked a lot about how the ministry came into existence. What I find and what I've found since taking on this role, coordination is a major, major issue, particularly when you have existing government agencies with responsibilities for a lot of these things that we are now finding ourselves doing. We need to find a way to better coordinate, because the DRA is supposed to be the lead agency in the country for rebuilding. But the question is, how do you coordinate better with other government agencies? Incineration has been something that a lot of people have talked about in terms of how we get rid of the debris quickly. We need to explore options for the elimination of all of the Dorian debris. And then, of course, transition to normalcy. How do we, get homeowners and the country to understand these recovery contracts have to end, municipal services have to resume, and homeowners have to take responsibility for their construction materials now that they're going back into rebuilding. So that's pretty much it. I just wanted to kind of lay out where we are, what our focus has been, and I hope the panel can assist us with just addressing and helping us wade through that whole issue of risk and challenges and what best practices may exist other places. So I thank you very much, and I hope I've stayed within my 15 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much, Mrs. Ford-Smith, for that very enlightening presentation. We've noted your challenges, and we commend you and your team for the work and the continued effort. It's excellent that the debris management was, for the most part, carried out by Bahamians, and that they were able to be employed and receive salaries. We know that members of the audience may have burning questions or comments for our keynote speaker. However, we are reminding everyone to post questions in the chat, as we are trying to unpack a lot of information in today's webinar. Our team will be monitoring the chat and responding to questions that are posted during the open dialogue question and answer period. Kindly be reminded to start by stating to whom your questions or comments are directed. This will be very helpful. Okay, we are thrilled about the upcoming part of the agenda, which will be the panel discussion featuring Mr. Best of the Caribbean Development Bank, Mr. Otsuyama of the University of Toronto, and Mr. Anaka of the Inter-American Development Bank. I would now like to hand it over to Mr. Yuri Shakalal, Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist in the IDB, who will moderate this session. Over to you, Yuri.
Thank you, Sarita. Good morning, everyone. Before we jump to the panel, I would just like to take this moment to basically thank Honorable Minister Lewis, Ms. Smith, and Daniela for their earlier contributions and for setting the tone and tenor of the upcoming discussion. It's a good segue to the panel on international good practices and lessons learned in post-disaster reconstruction. And specifically, we're going to explore how post-disaster reconstruction in a range of case study countries were established, managed, planned, and implemented. With us today on the panel, we have Dr. Kensuke Otsuyama from the University of Tokyo. Dr. Otsuyama is a researcher with the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology in the University of Tokyo. He holds a PhD of engineering from the Graduate School of Engineering of Kyoto University, and his main interest is pre-disaster recovery and reconstruction planning in Japan, the US, and in ASEAN countries. We also have Mr. Hideharu Tanaka, a Principal Disaster Risk Management Sector Advisor at the IDB on secondment from the Ministry of Finance, Government of Japan. And amongst his accomplishments are that Tanaka-san has served as a counselor in establishing the legal framework for reconstruction after the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011. And from our very own region, we have Mr. Daniel Best, the current director of the Caribbean Development Bank's project department. Director Best is a civil engineer with an MBA from the University of Durham and a project management professional. Actually, in another life, Mr. Best and I had many adventures post-Hurricane Tomas in reconstruction and rehabilitation programming for several of the OECS countries. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to these gentlemen for their commitment and willingness to share their expertise, and to you, the participants, for your interest and engagement. I think Sarita has gone over clearly the format. I will pose 3 to 4 questions for which I will invite each of the panelists to provide a 3-minute response. And it's our intent after this event to provide a synoptic brief on recommendations for reconstruction governance in the Bahamas. So if I can start with Dr. Otsuyama. What case study have you selected today for our workshop, and what was the scale of the impact of the disaster that you've selected to talk about?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Otsuyama, and I am one of specialists of recovery and reconstruction. And I selected the Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar because it was the worst disaster in the country. But I think it is also one of the entry point or turning point of the country in terms of disaster risk reduction policies and implementation. So I would like to talk about what happened about 12 years ago, 2008. More than 138 people missing and killed, mainly because of storm surge, and more than 2.4 million people affected because it's low-lying delta, lower than 8 meters or less than 10 feet. And some research says 82% of houses were destroyed because of this event. And 9.6 billion US dollar has the cost of this impact. So maybe you can find some similarity with what happened in Bahamas. And so it was really huge tragedy in the country, but I think this is a transformation point or entry point to change the country. I will show you later the evidence what happened. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Otsuyama. Tanaka-san, if I can pass the baton to you, can you tell us what case study you've selected and what was the scale of the impact of that event that you've selected to talk about?
Yes, thank you, Yuri-san, and good morning to everyone. And it's a very great pleasure and honor to join this workshop. As Yuri-san introduced, I will talk about the Great East Japan earthquake happened in March 2011. The scale of damage was very huge, and in fact, it is estimated once in 1,000 years. And in addition to the earthquake itself, the huge tsunami aftermath of the earthquake impacted a lot. And the tsunami swept away lives and properties of the mainly coastal area of East Japan. And in order to say recovery and reconstruction, we had to needed to mobilize full resources from the country, and this required introduction of new legal and institutional framework. I was working at the Cabinet Legislation Bureau at that time to drafting the introduction of this new framework. So I hope my presentation will help the Bahamas experience. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tanaka-san. And Director Best, I was just wondering what you might like to share in terms of a case study from the CDB today.
Sure, thanks so much, Chair. And I just want to first, of course, take a moment to thank the IDB and the government of Bahamas for inviting the CDB to participate in this very important forum. The case study which I selected to discuss today, Chair, is CDB's post-disaster support to the government of the British Virgin Islands following the passage of Hurricane Irma, which we in the Caribbean are unfortunately all too familiar with. It was a Category 5 storm in September of 2017, so not terribly dissimilar from Dorian in terms of the force of this particular catastrophic event. Like Dorian, the impact on the BVI was widespread. Devastation occurred throughout infrastructure and multiple sectors and the various islands of the British Virgin Islands. The damage assessment determined that the impact was over US $3.5 billion, and that is equivalent to 3 times the annual gross domestic product of the BVA. The tourism sector, again, quite similar to the Bahamas, with tourism being the mainstay of the British Virgin Islands, took the hardest hit with approximate damage of $2 billion US. And no sector was spared really. The water and sewage systems were severely damaged and disrupted. The electricity network, the road network. I heard the general manager, the CEO, sorry, speak to the infrastructural damage in the Bahamas, and it was quite similar to what would have occurred in the BVA. Road networks, ferry terminals, government buildings, schools, including administrative facilities, police stations were all impacted. A further similarity, however, is that the government of the BVA eventually created a special entity to manage their overall recovery effort. The Virgin Islands Recovery and Development Agency, or the RDA. And the RDA is a statutory corporation established under the Virgin Islands Recovery and Development Act of 2018 to execute the overall recovery to development plan, which the BVA would have drafted post Irma. And that aims to build back a better, stronger, greener, and more resilient BVA. RDA is funded by the government of the UK, the Virgin Islands, and other donors. And it is intended that it will be dissolved after a period of 5 years. But the work that it is mandated to do will thrust the recovery efforts of the BVA throughout the short and medium term, and launching it into a more long-term goal of sustainable development and recovery. So I see quite parallel tracks between what is being presented this morning and the really encouraging path that the Bahamas is taking with what the BVA has been doing. And hence, I selected that case study for discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. So we have 3 very interesting examples. We have the Cyclone Nargis, Myanmar experience, we have the Great Japan earthquake, and we have the experience, recent experience in the BVI. If I can turn to Dr. Otsuyama, from the example that you've shared, were there any specific policy initiatives for recovery and reconstruction over the short, medium, and long term? Might you say how they were sort of achieved in relation to the occurrence of the disaster event? And what would you say would be the main driver or coordinator of these policy initiatives?
Okay, so yeah, I'd like to show you the big picture first. The recovery of drivers, and also the recovery planning, and also the implementation after the disasters. So first, there are 3 main drivers. First, as national government, of course, the Natural Disaster Preparedness Central Committee. And also that huge disaster was difficult to control by the country. So ASEAN countries and UN agency, they combined as tripartite core group. This is kind of the collaborative group. And also they organize one DRR working group, which consists with local NGO, international NGOs, more than 49 organizations involved. So these 3 are main drivers. And 3 drivers prepared assessment and reviews, 4 times reviews. And also they prepared a recovery plan. So just after 3 months, they published National Reconstruction on Plan. This is kind of the framework for recovery and reconstruction. Based on the plan, they published a post-Nargis recovery preparedness plan after 6 or 7 months of the event. So the plan is actually the action plan for 3 years strategy, 2009 to 2011, and roughly $700 million US is for the cost of the recovery. But this recovery plan, reconstruction plan, is of course only for the disaster impacted area. So the national government decided to implement to non-impacted area. So they published natural hazard profile. This is kind of the assessment of the natural hazards. And also they prepare the national disaster risk reduction plan. And also they prepared the legislation as disaster management law. So this is the kind of the next step for the post-disaster resiliency, not only for the impacted area, but also the non-impacted area overall the country. And based on this structure and registration, another disaster happened in 2015 after 7 years. This is my main research interest because after 7 years, big disaster happened again in the country. But I will explain later the next question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Otsuyama. Very interesting. I noticed the leadership by a regional organization as well as the UN in that particular example that you've given, but particularly in terms of the sequence of plans and even to legislation is quite an interesting approach. Tanaka-san, for the Great Japan earthquake, in a similar vein to the question posed earlier, were there any particular policy initiatives over the short, medium, and long term? And when would you say were these achieved, and what would have been the main driver or coordinator of this?
Yes, thank you very much, Yuri-san. I will explain policy initiatives by the government of Japan in 5 steps with a timeline, and it took very long time. In the first step, the starting point is to estimate damages caused by the earthquake. And the Cabinet Office of Japan announced the damages caused by the earthquake amounted to US dollar 170 billion. Well, and the announcement was made 3 months after the earthquake. So it took 3 months to estimate, just to estimate damages. And the second step was to set up long-term reconstruction plan. It took another 1 month to set up this plan. And 3 months after the earthquake, the Parliament of Japan approved the so-called Basic Law for Reconstruction. And based on this Basic Law, at the end of July, this is more than 4 months from the earthquake, the Cabinet adopted Basic Plan for Reconstruction. This plan is for 10 years, covering 10 years, with the first 5 years as intensive reconstruction period. And the third place, the third point is done in parallel with the second step. Estimate fiscal demand for reconstruction and secure financial resources. Well, it's very difficult for the secure financial resources. It's mobilize a fund, and the estimate was US dollar 190 billion to be spent during the 10 years period of the plan. And of course, in the short time, the government of Japan can finance it by issuing governmental bond, but it has to be repaid. So the government introduced the temporary additional taxes on income tax and also corporate tax. And also the government sold stocks in public enterprises. And furthermore, the payroll for the government officials, including myself, has been cut at 7.8% during the 2 years after the just after the earthquake. But it is very important to secure the finance before entering to the reconstruction projects. And the fourth step is to set up a structure for implementing reconstruction plan with a solid legal framework. This is very important but difficult. And it took nearly 1 year to pass the law and the reconstruction agency, which is newly created agency, governmental agency, to start working. So the reconstruction agency started working at the end of February, the next year of the earthquake, nearly 1 year after the earthquake. And finally, the last step is very important as well, the steady implementation of the reconstruction, or yes, of course, but to plan with the periodical revision. The reconstruction agency has to report the progress every year to the Diet, and also in every 5 years, a comprehensive revision will be taken place, and both plan and the estimate of the impact. So these 5 steps are the policy initiatives taken by Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanaka-san. If I can have a quick follow-up, I think it was very interesting, your comparison of the time frame, and maybe intimating a little bit that it took a little bit of time, but I think given the scale of impact, scale of loss, and the steps that you outlined, I would say that a year is relatively fast in some of our contexts elsewhere in the region. But the question I'd like to follow up very quickly on is the reconstruction bond. Was that all domestic finance in terms of where the bond was floated, or was it also internationally floated?
Well, the bond was issued in domestic market, but I think that many foreign investors are buyers of the bond.
Okay, okay, good to know, good to know. Okay, Mr. Best, I don't know if you have any similar insights on the situation in the BVI, and even in particular, as a regional agency, any kind of particular type of policy measures that CDB would have taken or you would have observed in the BVI?
Yeah. Thanks so much, Chair. We would not have gotten into the actual drafting of the policy approach that the BVA would have taken. As I mentioned earlier, the BVA would have established a recovery and development plan, a policy directive as to how they would come out of the impact of Irma. And one of the directives of that would have been the establishment of the RDA. And we weren't involved in the establishment of the RDA. We would have provided some just high-level guidance, and I'll come to that in a minute. But what I'd like to say, if I may, in terms of what CDB's role would have been, if that's okay, Chair, what we did was we provided initial support in the form of an emergency response grant to the BVI to provide emergency supplies such as tarpaulins, water, and emergency relief supplies to those who had been impacted, and services to those who had been impacted. And this was followed by an immediate response loan in the amount of about $750,000 to clean up and restore essential services. But what all of this then led to was the provision of a capital loan to the BVA of $65 million US to support the reconstruction and rehabilitation effort. And this is all anchored within the CDB's disaster management strategy and operational guidelines. In other words, how we support our countries in both the pre and post disaster period. But this case demonstrated, I would say, the bank's agility in responding to the country's needs. In particular, the design of the intervention included agreeing to modifications to our standard lending and procurement terms as it relates to the DIMSOG, or the disaster management strategy, as I just mentioned, in order to facilitate the creation of a project that could best meet the needs of the country and the urgent needs of the multiple sectors impacted. And this is important. If there's a lesson to be learned coming out of the BVA experience, it is that the response needs to be tailored match the impact and the specific impact to the country. The other thing I would mention, of course, is that we also responded with respect to balancing the requirements for risk reduction, preparedness, and residual risk management measures, and placing emphasis on opportunities for community-level resilience. In the opening keynote presentation, I think that was a point that came up quite clearly, and it is one that we perhaps shouldn't move too far away from, which is that the disasters often occur at the community level. Well, of course, it's a broad-scale domestic impact, but how can we get persons at the community and at the country level benefiting from procurement opportunities? And we would have worked with the country to see how we could tailor certain things within our procurement guidelines in the post-disaster period to support that recovery effort. The other point I would want to make is that the project design also included features to build long-term resilience, including early warning and communication facilities to aid any future disaster preparedness and response. It's important to include pre-disaster proactive interventions into the program where possible. And of course, the designs would have to incorporate climate risks and vulnerabilities assessments on all of the sectors. I just close my response to this one by noting that while we weren't involved in the establishment of the RDA, what we assisted with is an assessment of the institution, recognizing that the need to attract and mobilize donor funding would be important. Recognizing that the initial loan that CDB gave, the capital loan, was to the government of the Bahamas. What we did was an assessment, an institutional assessment of the RDA, and we identified some gaps that they would need to fill to become, for want of a better term, more marketable for catalyzing resources, and of course also for utilizing the CDB resources that our board would have approved. And we supported them in the recruitment of additional personnel and filling key gaps within the development of the RDA. So essentially we adopted what we would want to term a bit of an end-to-end type approach, a wraparound type approach to bolstering what they were seeking to do with the RDA, while of course also liaising quite closely with the government of the British Virgin Islands.
Okay, thank you for that response. Actually, I'm quite interested in some of the points that you made, particularly on reinforcing the fact that we need to tailor the response to the impact. And I think it's a key principle to keep in the back of the mind. The point that you made about community, well made, but it's interesting, and maybe I should have a quick follow-up there to say, how would you gauge the responsiveness of the board of a multilateral development bank like CDB in the context of the willingness to tailor the approach and adjust policies and strategies of lending and intervention?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Yuri. Thanks for that. You know, there's an unfortunate term, never waste a good disaster. But the impact, the scale of the impact of these disasters, Irma, Dorian, even as you know, Erica with Dominica, Maria, the board is seized of the need to respond. We're seeing it right now with COVID. The board members are fully seized of the scale of the impact and the need to get donor financing, not just into the country, but have it translate into restoring livelihoods, have it translate into restoring infrastructure, and responding to the need on the ground. So we have found our board to be amenable to many of these suggestions. One of the things I would suggest, which we actually didn't need to go to the board for, it's not suggest put forward here, is that as you know, we have certain modality thresholds within the procurement guidelines are defined. So, you know, contracts of a certain, contract packages rather, of a certain limit go to national competitive bidding, and above that goes to international competitive bidding, yeah? One of the points which Ms. Smith made in her opening remarks is how can we get local contractors involved? And so with the BVA, one of the things we looked at, one was, where is that threshold pegged for certain contracts, like an administrative building, for instance? Yes, the requirements for pre-qualification for the contractors are set at a certain level, but it is essentially just a building, you know, for want of, I'm speaking a bit loosely here, but it is a building. Do we really need international competitive bidding for that? As opposed to a maritime facility, which we all agree we need international competitive bidding for. So it's a matter of working with the country to determine where can we peg these thresholds to perhaps provide opportunities, open, fair, transparent, the three pillars of procurement. We're not deviating from that, but open, fair, transparent possibility, procurement opportunities to local contractors. Is this kind of discussion dialogue that's needed in the post-disaster period?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that contribution. And I think we're getting a flavor of really how complex the challenge is, particularly post-catastrophic impacts and this type of level of reconstruction required. Moving on to the third round of questions, and maybe for Dr. Otsuyama, in terms of the Myanmar example, could you tell us what key challenges and lessons learned from the policy interventions that were made, and any kind of recommendations you would like to share in the context of Bahamas's reconstruction from that experience?
Yes, thank you. So the biggest challenge was the long-term resilience. This is what Mr. Best mentioned earlier. So as I mentioned, what happened in 2015 after 7 years from Cyclone Nargis, actually we don't know what natural hazard will impact where. We can anticipate. Actually, the flood impact in the northern part from the Cyclone Nargis. You can find the black star on the map. So actually, recovery effort was enough in Delta region, but it didn't implement it in non-impacted place. As you can see these pictures, the area is always suffering from floods, and the villagers built elevated house by their own. So it means recovery effort in impacted area works, of course, but the point is how it implement to another place where might happen something in the future. So this village, international NGO support to construct the elementary school is kind of the center point in the village. But most important thing is actually human resource. I have experience of research in this village, and I met a person. He maybe graduate elementary school or middle school. Maybe he don't know about disasters, but actually he was trained in the center. So could you go to the next slide? So actually there are several recommendations by the national government, but yes, this is the Disaster Management Training Center is the one of recommendation from my side. So it was established based on the action plan and laws in 2017. And this Disaster Management Training Center is not only for the practitioner, but also the villagers. So as I show you the picture, that was a really rural village which suffered from floods. But one person was trained in this center So he was equipped how to survive. So for the long-term resilience for the nationwide, this kind of human resource training center is one of the entry point for the next step. So actually it successfully working in Myanmar. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Otsuyama. Very interesting, that example. Tanaka-san, I don't know if there are any key challenges and lessons. I know the scale is quite different, and the hazard is quite different in this particular example that you've chosen, but any particular type of recommendations you might like to share for based on that experience?
Yes, thank you very much, Yuri-san. My recommendation is twofold. In the first place, I will explain about the general recommendation to the country, and in the second place, my recommendation is how to set up an institution, especially reconstruction agency. Well, in the first place, I'd like to point out 4 points for the country to achieve robust reconstruction. The first point is to ensure political will and commitment. In case of Japan, the Prime Minister acted as chairperson of the Emergency Response Headquarters and then the chairperson of Council for Promoting Reconstruction. This ensures that, and all the ministers say, worked as a member of this headquarters and then the council. So this ensures that all the ministers are informed and committed to the reconstruction. And in case of Bahamas, the very presence of Honorable Minister Luis here is very encouraging for me to show the political will. So it's very good. And the second point is a clear plan with a guiding principle. Well, I mentioned we had a basic plan for reconstruction, and of course, this is based on the principle of build back better. This sort of a clear plan is definitely required. And the third point is a legal and institutional framework. Of course, that the plan is very good, but in order to implement the plan, need to have a legal and institutional framework. And the final point is a periodical verification and revision. The plan is very important, but situation and circumstances will change after years, and the reconstruction will take long years, like 5 or even 10 years. So we have to revise the plan and revisit plan periodically, say ideally 5 years, I guess. And then I turn to the recommendation, 3-point recommendation for the rather pragmatic ones for institutional framework. Reconstruction agency in Japan is working well, very well so far. And the feature of the agency, I can point out three important issues. The first one is clear and strong mandate. This agency, newly created agency, has the proper minister in charge of the agency, and also has an authority, clear authority and mandate. For example, the agency has a power to make recommendations to other ministries and local governments as well. And second point is budget management. We created special accounts for reconstruction, and all the revenue and expenditure related to the reconstruction are included in this special account. And this reconstruction agency is serving as a manager of this special account. This ensures that the financial resources are properly managed. And the last but the least, recruitment of the staff is important. Since the agency is newly created, we have to recruit staff with expertise. And the agency has more than 200 staffs, and almost all of them are seconded from relevant ministries. For example, Minister of Construction, Minister of Agriculture and Fishery, Home Affairs, Commerce, and also Finance. And they are coming to the reconstruction agency typically for 2 or 3 year terms. And some of them are from local government and private sector as well. This sort of a mixture of expertise ensures smooth cooperation and also information sharing. Sorry to be a long presentation, but even in Japan, this sort of reconstruction takes a long time. I said we made a 10-year plan, but the reconstruction agency will extend another 10 years to complete its job. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tanaka-san. Very, very interesting points. Daniel, I'm just wondering if there are any particular key challenges and lessons that you would like to share from a CDB perspective and based on the BVI experience that might be relevant to the Bahamas in your estimation.
Certainly, Yuri. Unfortunately, the challenges in the post-disaster period in our region aren't dissimilar from the challenges in regular times. And they're anchored in procurement. The challenges are anchored in procurement. The timely recruitment, procurement of engineering consultants was one of the main challenges that we face with respect to the reconstruction effort. Recruitment and procurement of engineering consultants to undertake the design of the infrastructure. Although we would have sought as far as is possible to adjust the procurement guidance as I discussed earlier, the engineering designs take time. And before we even get to that, we need engineering consultants on board. And going through a request for expression of interest, a request for proposals, and then going through the respective tenders boards, tenders committees, and the evaluation process takes time. Now, I want to set that up that this takes time in normal times. So you can imagine trying to pull together an evaluation committee when the entire country has been decimated. So, you really need to spare a thought for the member countries who are attempting to do this. And so one of the things I'd like to suggest, even at this point, I know we'll come to suggestions at some point, but one of the things I'd like to suggest is that to speed up this process is that countries may want to consider a pre-existing framework where consultants, at least consultants would have been shortlisted previously, a long short list, if you will, that rather than now starting a procurement process and now doing evaluations in a post-disaster period, you have engineering consultants in a pool that you may select from that would have already been screened by whether it's IDB, CDB, whichever donor agency, and we as the donor partners are okay with this pool of consultants which the countries can draw on. That would be one. The other thing on our side, of course, is that we are, during this year, revising our disaster management strategy and operational guidelines. So we expect to have more robust, more flexible procurement modalities in the post-disaster period for our board member countries. So that is certainly expected to help. The other thing, of course, is which is linked to procurement, but the length of time for contract approval within the countries. Outside of the evaluation and all that, as I mentioned, going through the various approval agencies in countries, whether it's tenders board, whether it's cabinet, whatever it may be, that needs to be looked at and streamlined with respect to the contract approval process. The final point I would want to make here is consultation. Wide consultation of the relevant stakeholders is key. With respect to the fact that, yes, the Recovery and Development Agency has been set up in the BVA, the fact remains that many of the subject matter experts for the longer term, as I mentioned, this is a 5-year setup in the initial instance. The longer term sustainability of the construction efforts will reside back to the line ministries, unless there is a change down the road. As of right now, that is not the plan. So consultations with the ministries of works, consultations with the relevant ministries of the environment, consultations with the communities impacted to gain a level of ownership in what is done going forward, to gain a level of ownership in the outcomes that are envisaged, and hence the designs that are going to be implemented is, I mean, I can't overstate the significance of that, because at every stage throughout the project cycle, you're going to want to make sure that the beneficiaries, who essentially are the owners of the infrastructure, whether it's a school plant or otherwise, are satisfied with what you are implementing. So I couldn't overstate the importance of consultation at the earliest possible point and all throughout the project cycle to ensure the outcomes delivered are meets the needs of the beneficiaries.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Okay, gentlemen, I think you've done very well in a very short space of time in terms of the diversity of examples and pulling out some of the key principles. If I might summarize, particularly for this last round of questions in terms of some of what I see coming out, the issue of making sure there's political will, a clear plan, obviously finance, looking at financial models, special accounts. Dr. Otsuyama talked about training. Daniel mentioned particularly the issue of consultation, community, private sector, that type of thing. Tanaka-san mentioned legal and institutional framework, making sure that that's in place, and periodic monitoring and staffing. But I think the point that you made, Daniel, on the procurement is an interesting one, because in a sense, I think it's a cue or a selection pressure on agencies, domestic agencies in the region, multilateral development banks, etc., to revisit some of the way they're programming in this space when this comes around, when this type of event comes around. So we see a lot of, in a sense, reactionary type of situations where new institutions are created very quickly on the fly. Post-Ivan in Grenada, 2004, the Agency for Reconstruction and Development. We have the agency in Dominica. We have Bahamas as example. We have the BVI's example. But the point I'm trying to make is that we have to give this a little bit more ex-ante consideration. And in terms of how our procurement works, how our planning works, how our institutional response works, for these types of things. So before I close, I'd like to throw out to all the panelists any sort of last observations before we go to the Q&A that might come up in the chat. Any last observations, practical, operational observations? I noticed that Ms. Best, Ms. Smith talked a lot about coordination, and I don't know if there are any kind of insights, operational insights that any of you would like to share based on those experiences. The floor is open. Any takers? Yeah.
Sure.
Dr. Otsuyama, yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd like to say the disaster will repeat, of course, and Japan, so many disasters every year or 1,000 years ago. So as Yuri mentioned, ex ante or pre-disaster recovery planning or pre-disaster investment always required, not only for national level, but also community level. No plan, no actions. So I think investment flow should be not post-disaster, should be pre-disaster. Just the comments. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you very much for that observation. Tanaka-san, you wanted to say anything?
Yes, of course, that ex-ante planning or preparation is very important, but I think it's a learning process. And also the idea of build back better is have some sort of ex-ante preparation. Well, just not the recovery, but making a better thing.
Yes, thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Rudy. There's just two final points that I want to make. Thanks for throwing it back out. The first is that one of the things we did, and I'm happy that Ms. Smith raised the point about collaboration. One of the things we did in the BVA, we, as part of the project design, we actually recruited a UN agency to assist the BVA in staff recruitment and in pulling together the necessary resources to manage the plan. This was even before the RDA came into being. We recognize the capacity constraints in all of our member countries. It's not an indictment of BVA, but in all of our member countries. And in this post-disaster period, having that additional support to guide the stretched resources in country, we saw that as being an imperative. So that collaboration, not just at the domestic level, as you and I have spoken about, but also at the developmental agency level is important. I think we put some stress on our countries when they're seeking to talk to so many different agencies. So we actually worked through a UN agency in the initial stages. The second point I want to make really quickly is the importance of psychosocial support. The unit of development is the citizen. It's not a kilometer of road, it's not a classroom. And if we don't appreciate that in the post-disaster period, our citizenry, they're traumatized. And so what we sought to implement and to include in as part of our disaster management strategy is providing training and counseling through, I mean, we don't have expertise in health, as you know, here at CDB. So we use the PAHOs within our region and other type agencies to provide a level of counseling to counselors, as well as to, you know, single parent homes and others, because, you know, it's difficult to ask persons to build back when in fact they're so traumatized they don't know the way forward. So psychosocial support is one I wouldn't want us to take our eyes off of as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Les. Very important point. Gentlemen, I'm going to close the panel, but just like to express my thanks for the very insightful feedback that you provided in a very focused way in a very short period of time. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, and one of the challenges facing many of the small island states in the Caribbean is debt. And so part of the challenge, if we're going to have hurricane seasons like we have this year, more frequently occurring in the future, is making sure that ex ante that we have some level of capacity built up. And obviously that challenge comes with the challenge of the debt and the economic situation, and currently complicated by COVID in terms of our tourism-dependent economies, many of our tourism-dependent economies in this region. So I'd like to thank you very much, and I'd like to turn it back over to Sarita and Franklin for any additional comments to the panel or questions to the panel from all the participants here. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for this session. Thank you very much, panelists. And just wanted to make it clear that Mr. Otsuyama is from the University of Tokyo. So apologies for that. We have to move now quickly into our question and answer session, which will be moderated by Franklin Espigna. Franklin, over to you, please. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your participation, especially for the authorities of the government of Bahamas. Due to time constraints, we have received several questions that are already, some of them we are going to follow up later, but we are going to follow up them. Also, Mrs. Smith has, and other authorities also has addressed it on the chat. So we are going to concentrate in 3 main questions to the panelists that we have received, and in order to make it efficient and getting their experiences. So this is for Dr. Otoyama. In Myanmar, the National Reconstruction Plan was developed just after 1 to 2 months after the event. What was the reasons or key factors of why that plan was developed so quickly, and what were the success key histories on that plan? That you already mentioned some of them.
Okay, thank you very much. The first reconstruction framework was established within 3 months because it's prepared by ministries. So it's kind of the summary framework. So that was the before detailed assessment. So it looks like a bit wishing list rather than the detailed recovery and reconstruction plan. But of course, they need to show the first framework of reconstruction. So they decided to show what was the direction of recovery and reconstruction.
Thank you very much. It's a question from Mr. Tanaka. During the process that you mentioned and you described in your presentation that took 5-step plan to agree by the different stakeholders, what the recording was taking place? How did the work mitigate the general public expectations on how the work was executed? How is it going, and is it on the schedule?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And this 5 to 10 years reconstruction period is concentrated on reconstruction. And during the formation of this plan, just 1 year, just after the earthquake, of course, that emergency responses took place very much robustly, such as providing temporary housing or stabilizing the prices or ensuring the supply for basic necessities such as oil and food supplies. So this sort of emergency responses are taking place in parallel with forming long-term reconstruction plan.
Thank you very much. And this is the last question, again, due to time constraints with the schedule and of the agenda. This is from Mr. Director Daniel Best. Irma and Maria hit several islands, including British Virgin Island, that is the case study in this workshop. Other countries like Dominica were affected. So how do you think the progress of reconstruction so far is going in the case of British Virgin Island in a comparative manner with other islands like Dominica and other affected that you have been evaluating or following up?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. It's an interesting question. I think the situation in BVI, because of some of the challenges I mentioned, the project is perhaps a little bit more delayed. I think now with the establishment of the RDA and the plans that have been put in place, we're seeing quite a bit more momentum now within that. But as compared, for instance, to the electricity rehabilitation in Dominica, which went forward relatively smoothly, while some other areas within Dominica also, were delayed. So it's not a homogeneous kind of, the entire country was moving at a certain rate of progress. There's some sectors were doing better than others, and we see that in many of our countries. But we are pleased now that in discussions with BVA and the plans that have been put in place, and more importantly, procurement packages that have now moved forward. We're happy with where the project is moving towards.
Thank you very much. I'll take one last question for Mrs. Smith. There have been some information in the chat or questions in the chat regarding debris management and debris incineration and things like that. So can you describe a little bit more how the debris were handled, and if DRA is considering other ways of recycling and reusing the debris instead of the incineration?
Thank you. I did answer some of this questions to all the panelists and the members of the grouping. What has happened right now is we have 3 or 4 debris management sites, and all of the debris coming from the Keys in Abaco and coming from the area in East Grand Bahama where a lot of the debris was taken and removed out of communities go to these debris management sites. These debris management sites are operated, and we have contracted the operation of these sites to different companies. And right now we have a lot of debris piled up on these sites. The debris is being segregated, but I really had a question to either Daniel Best to find out in VTVI how much debris was really collected as a result of the hurricane. We estimate to date that we've moved 3 million cubic yards of debris out of the Keys in Abaco, mainland Abaco, and Grand Bahama. So my question for us is, how much did you, and the other 2 panelists could comment, but how much debris are you moving or moved as a result of these case studies? Where did you move it? How did you get rid of it? How did you segregate it? I wanted to hear a little bit more about how that was handled.
Thank you very much. Mr. Best, please.
Yeah, thanks. That's a fantastic question. Interestingly enough, our project did not capture debris management. It started with more the designs and rehabilitation and reconstruction. But what I do know is that, in one instance, for instance, the BVA needed to move 240 yachts that had been destroyed. And if you consider the size of the BVA, this is quite significant. But the debris, once collected, and I don't have a tonnage that I can tell you, but once collected, it was barged out of the country. The details of the handlers and the recipient, I could probably get to you offline. But it was barged. It wasn't handled within BVA. So after it was collected and destroyed, put into more manageable sizes, collected, it was barged out of the British Virgin Islands.
Thank you very much. Any comment from the other 2 panelists, Mr. Otsuyama or Mr. Tanaka, regarding debris management in those study cases?
Actually, I have no direct answers to management of debris, but in Japan, now we are trying to prepare the storage place for debris before this disaster happens. So, yeah, but I really understand, even though after 9 years since tsunami, it's still a big issue of disaster debris.
Just I want to add one point that in case of the earthquake, Great Japan, East Japan earthquake, as I mentioned, the tsunami hit heavily to the nuclear power plants. So huge chunk of the debris are contaminated by radioactive substances. So the debris management was too much complicated, and still we need to manage or contain the radioactive substances. So this is a very, very great challenge even now.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that we conclude this round of questions and answers. We will take a note of all the questions that have been done, post in the chat, and we will follow up them in case of were not answered directly by some of the representatives of the government. Thank you very much. I pass to Sirita Roberts.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for your many questions. Very interesting. It shows the value of shared perspectives, listening, understanding, applying what we are facing here in the Bahamas with experiences that are being shared by our guest panelists. As we prepare to close, I would now like to invite Mrs. Maria Eugenia Roca, who is our Chief of Operations in the Bahamas Country Office, to give closing remarks. Over to you, please, Maru.
Thank you, Sarita, and thank you everyone for participating in today's workshop. Indeed, this session has been an engaging one for all involved that provided strategic operational insight on some lessons learned and post-disaster reconstruction. There have been several good examples presented by our key speakers and panelists. For example, the first one, we see the need for planning at a national level and a community level. Second one, we heard that consultation and collaboration also need to drive the way forward. We will not be able to do it alone. We need collaboration and coordination. And third one, as we move forward in that transition to normally, we need to ensure that the community and the people that are in these communities always are protected. So I agree with Minister Lewis in the move to be resilient. I thank all of the panelists and the speakers, and especially the attendees, with your questions and with all concerns and thoughts that you shared through the chat. This session has definitely left us with food for thought. One, we will implement strategies for building back better. So thank you very much to all, and let's continue to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Roca. Thank you very much for your participation this morning, everyone. This has been a very informative session. We couldn't have done it without you. We will be sharing a summary of the meeting and the recording with all participants, and we look forward to further dialogue and sharing of good practices and lessons learned in post-disaster reconstruction. If there are any more questions related to this presentation, please email them to us. I will ensure that it's posted in the chat before everyone leaves. The country office mailbox, which is, and I'll say it out, cof-cbh@iadb.org. And I am also putting it here in the chat. Please have a look at it. Any more questions, comments that you have for us related to this workshop, please send it there. Thank you all, and have a very good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much.
Very much.